Hello, everybody. We are here to talk about Rings of Power again because the first season has officially concluded, and we've got some thoughts about the show as a whole. So I'm gonna let these three take it away. Rings of Power. What do you think?
I'm gonna feel like a little bit of a hypocrite here because in relation to a lot of the complaints that I have read about Rings of Power, about some of the compression or changing of the lore um as it exists in the Silmarillion, and some of the problems that people have with the show, I'm just gonna give a huge shrug and say that stuff didn't bother me, but I am a hypocrite because I realize that I only don't care because I'm not deeply invested in the source material. Like, if we were having this conversation about the TV show of Wheel of Time, I'd be frothing at the mouth right now and like yelling at the screen because I love that series so much. It's one of the foundational ones for me. And when I watched that show, I wanted to, gouge out my own eyes. But I really do think it boils down to when it comes to these adaptations, how much do you know and love the source material? If it's important to you, these kind of adaptations are almost never going to hit the spot for you. And I almost feel like an adaptation that does hit the spot for the super fan is going to flop with everybody else. I don't know. I could be totally wrong about that, but that's sort of how I feel.
Well, there is actually a good case study for that because I watched the adaptation of Watchmen from like last
Yeah.
decade or something, and it was very faithful to the source material, and I loved it because it was. And I talked to my brother about it, who had also read Watchmen, and he was like, "Yeah, a lot of people didn't like it because it was just too accurate, and Watchmen is really depressing." But with, at least for me, with the Rings of Power adaptation, I am not a super lore master of Tolkien lore, but I am interested in it enough that after finishing the season, I did pre-order a copy of the Silmarillion in hardcover because I want to feel sophisticated. But also, I wasn't really bothered by the fact that what I knew of the creation of the rings and what happens with the creation of the rings in the show was very different, partially because I understood that they had to do it that way. Like, with the rights that they have and the fact that they do not have the rights to all of the Silmarillion, I was just like, I went into the last couple episodes of the show going, okay, I know that they can't do it how I want them to. I'm just going to see what they do instead. And I really liked what they came up with in terms of how to tell the story of Sauron essentially catalyzing the creation of the rings, given that they couldn't do what Sauron actually does in the Silmarillion. So I'm in the sweet spot between I wish they could have done it differently, but also I appreciate what they did manage to do, and I feel like I'm probably in the minority with that opinion.
Yeah, to jump on to that, I will say The Lord of the Rings was the first fantasy series, like big letters fantasy series that I read as a kid, right? The first kind of major property. I read it in fifth grade. My parents were like, "You can't watch the movies until you read these books." And I think they did that because they were like, he's not going to read these books, but jokes on them, because I did. And then I watched all the movies. And to this day, those might be, they're in competition for my favorite movies, just all the time. They're the ones that consistently make me the most emotional. But nonetheless, I mean, do I think that Rings of Power was a perfect landing, handled impeccably by all involved? Most certainly not, right? But I loved it. I like it a whole lot anyways. Yeah, I think I just kind of to the point of what you were talking about, Cameron, because this is also something that gets run into with like Dungeons and Dragons and other things in other nerd spaces, right? I think sometimes maybe there's a bit of we love a thing because there's ownership of it, of what it is. We've sunk so much time into it that we are like masters of what it is. And then when it changes, we feel betrayed by the thing that we've mastered. And I think that's such a bummer, because like oftentimes the changes that are made make it so that it's more accessible to new people. So yeah, it's a tough, nasty thing sometimes.
I think there are certainly some fair quibbles that people can have with this first season of Rings of Power. It has the evergreen problem that fantasy shows run into of travel time, of crossing entire maps in 36 hours, and this army shows up out of nowhere, and how could they even be there yet? And that's a little ridiculous. I have yet to encounter a good fantasy series that hasn't done that. On top of that, there were a handful of lines that for me were pretty clunky. That being said, when I look at some of the criticism online, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, because you get people talking about how just awful the writing was and how it's utterly ridiculous and such poor production values. And did we watch the same show? I'm not even sure. Like, there seems to be such a hyperbole involved with everybody. If you hate it, then it has to be the worst thing ever, and if you like it, then you can speak no ill of it, and that doesn't do anybody any good on either side.
One of the bits of criticism that I heard that actually did have a fair point, even though I didn't agree with it, was the end of, I think it was episode 6. I don't remember exactly how they landed, but it was the creation of Mordor, when Mount Doom explodes and there's a giant pyroclastic flow just enveloping the entirety of the Númenórean and Southlander army. And the criticism that was raised was, no one can survive that. Like, if you understand anything about how pyroclasm works, no one would have realistically survived that. And it's true. But one of the strengths of Lord of the Rings in general, not just Rings of Power, but this goes all the way back to the original Lord of the Rings movies, when Aragorn falls off a cliff and somehow manages to survive that, is that they can get away. In my opinion, they can get away with that sort of thing a lot easier than something like Game of Thrones, because they're not going for realism in the first place. Like, Game of Thrones couldn't get away with a miraculous everyone lives through something that should have surely killed the moment, because Game of Thrones is trying to go for the realistic, gritty aspect. Lord of the Rings and Rings of Power is far less concerned with the nitty-gritty realism and more about the spectacle and the majesty of Tolkien's world. So I can understand some criticisms of it, especially in the regard of they're just hand waving away a bunch of things, but that's what Tolkien does. No one really knows what Gandalf can do, what Gandalf does in Lord of the Rings. No one really knows how the light of the Valar works and how it goes from a tree into the Mithril ore. We don't care. We just like that it's magical and cool, and that's the kind of attitude that I honestly want them to tap more into with Lord of the Rings, because that's really the draw of it over something like House of the Dragon or Game of Thrones.
Yeah, we're looking at the romantic ideal, and just like romanticism in general, it is as unrealistic and unattainable as it is beautiful and aspirational, right? Yeah, 100% big agree, right? And if that's not people's cup of tea, that's fine. Maybe it's just not, right? I do want to say really quick, this is a bit of a pivot. I don't know if that's okay with everybody, but I feel like thus far our conversation has kind of been us reacting to the reactions of the Rings of Power. So just by way of like a little bit of reactions and just kind of some stuff that I enjoyed, I loved Arondir. I know a lot of people don't like the guy, but I think Arondir as both like an actor and as a character might have been this season's strongest point for me personally. I liked it a lot. Also really loved Durin, specifically the actor who played Durin, right? I know we're generally a writing discussion channel, right? And so I am probably by far and away not the most qualified individual to praise or criticize someone's dramatic performance in film or anywhere else. But I did really like how Durin's actor played the character. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
And the friendship between Durin and Elrond was pretty pitch perfect for me throughout, where I consistently enjoyed watching them play off each other, and it felt like a real friendship.
Male friendship is something that Lord of the Rings and Tolkien in general just does very well. Like from Frodo and Sam onward. Like I love Lord of the Rings because male friendship can just exist with on something other than like conflict or machoism. But for me, my favorite reaction, and I told you all about this in the Discord previously, but my favorite reaction to Rings of Power was in episode 5. Because up until that point, I'd been kind of hesitant with the show because they had so much that they had to live up to in terms of the shadow of the Lord of the Rings movies. And so like watching the first 4 episodes or so, I was like, this is good, but where's that sweeping romantic Tolkien spectacle that I'm looking for? And then Poppy's walking song in episode 5, like knowing that Tolkien was a linguist who loves his songs, just that scene right there. And it did show them traveling hundreds of miles in the space of like 2 minutes. Just that scene right there made me go, all right, I'm in love with this world now. You guys have managed to hook me. And I was fine that it happened in episode 5. They did enough in the first couple episodes to keep me going to that moment. And it felt much better to the fact that I felt like it was a bit of a reward for going, look, you stuck with us this far. Here's something even better for you. Like that's the reaction that will stay with me from that season, beyond all of the debates over characterization and realism and such. Just the song and the Harfoots. It was like coming home to the Shire. It's like the music that plays when you come home to the Shire, just in how calm and beautiful it was.
It's talking about things that we liked. It's a shame that we don't have Mari here with us today, since she had so much to say about how much she loved Galadriel falling for the bad boy and the doomed romance there. And I mean, they did it well. I have to say, it worked for me.
We'll have to get her back for a future episode. That
Yeah.
that discourse cannot go unspoken.
Also, just the actor's performance during that particular reveal, right? Like this is a spoiler episode. And so we all know it was Halbrand, right? It was Halbrand all along, to quote everyone's favorite Marvel song, right? But I also just really loved like that scene oscillated so quickly and in my opinion so well between like charming and beguiling and endearing, and then very quickly over to wrathful and dangerous, fickle. Just really kind of like went back and forth between those two ends in a way that I liked quite a bit.
I especially appreciate the added depth that it retroactively gives to the entire original trilogy of making Sauron an actual character that moves and changes and is more than simply the embodiment of evil, unchanging and unending. I mean, it's more interesting to see him as a person who changes.
Yeah. I've heard some people being like, "Oh, is Sauron like good now because he's out here arguing?" But it's like, no, he's just the broken villainous character that's very good about arguing why they should be allowed to be broken and villainous, right? The pinnacle of toxicity. He's a bad guy to be around. So yeah, loved that.
The best kinds of reveals, for me at least, are the ones that say something about the characters doing the revealing and such. Like, I love me a good plot twist where I go, oh my gosh, the story's going to change from here on out. But I love the plot twists more that make me go, oh, how is this person going to react to this? And just props to, I wish I could recall her name off the top of my head, but props to Galadriel's actress, because she and actor who plays Halbrand, whose name I also don't remember, I'm sorry, but those two, just the amount, I'm going to channel Mari for a second, the amount of chemistry between them in that scene, just seeing the reaction from "you were my friend" to "you are awful" to "do you have a point" to "no, you definitely don't have a point." Just, it was a veritable roller coaster of emotions, and they played it to the hilt so well. And like, props to everyone involved with writing that arc, because it landed almost perfectly for me, at least.
Yeah, yeah. The spectacle of that moment also was, yeah. Sorry, Cameron, you go.
No, it's fine. You touch on something interesting there too, which is that a lot of the reveals, for anybody who has even a passing familiarity with Tolkien's work and lore, were telegraphed pretty early and fairly obviously, to where it's not like they were trying to pull the rug out and say, "Surprise, this is the villain," but rather, like Jonah was saying, how is this character going to handle this revelation? And I thought that was at least as interesting, if not more so, than the "aha, you didn't see this coming" sort of thing.
One quick thing I just wanted to toss out there, because obviously this has been a very polarizing show. I wondered how the end, or just even the last few episodes, really changed maybe how people felt about the show. I'm just wondering how many people kind of wrote it off early or just kept watching it to hate on it, you know what I mean? Versus, I feel like we're seeing now a bit more of a resurgence of people being like, wait, this is cool, this is fun, I am enjoying this. Whereas with Wheel of Time, I felt like it sort of went the other direction, right? Like, it was, as it got near the end, people were like, what is this ending? And then like all this hate sort of piled on Wheel of Time retroactively. Whereas with Rings of Power, I feel like I'm seeing something just a little bit different happening. I was curious to hear your thoughts with that.
Well, for me, it's honestly, if I had to compare the ending of first season of Wheel of Time versus Ring of Power, it's almost the opposite sort of arc, where in Rings of Power they started out feeling very different from Tolkien and just the ideas, that the expectations that people had in general. And by the end, we see the rings created. We didn't get the whole arc of Sauron disguising himself as an elf and teaching Celebrimbor how to make the rings, but we got seeds of that at least. And so for me, I wonder if the more positive reaction to the ending of Rings of Power was because it went from more distantly connected to Tolkien's lore to more coalescing into something recognizably Lord of the Rings by the end. And it helped justify the changes they made to Galadriel's character with the Sauron reveal, because they went, look, guy, after the first episode aired, they were like, look, guys, this is a Galadriel who's reckless and she's very impulsive and she's very flawed. And by the end, with the Sauron reveal, Galadriel is also realizing that, and it felt very justified in how they handled it, in how they handled the beginning with how they handled the ending. Like, the message I got from the ending of season 1 of Rings of Power was, we know what we're doing, can you trust us, please? Whereas with Wheel of Time, the ending kind of made me hear, we don't know what we're doing, please don't trust us anymore.
I will say I was on board from episode 1, and so it's a bit of a thought exercise for me, but I can't see the gradual coalescing of season 1, right? Where the threads come together and begin to make more sense as they coalesce. And I think that you're right there, that there is at least a contingent of folks who were initially skeptical, who are, willing to take the journey. I think they've done a smart thing, and at least part of the story with the stranger, presumably Gandalf, taking him off the map, so to speak, into territory that is not really covered in Tolkien's lore, so that we can see something new and interesting there. That hopefully will then dovetail back into existing lore nicely. I mean, that remains to be seen, but I've got sufficient trust in these storytellers that I'm willing to take the ride.
I really quick to that point, it is a lot of people are also theorizing that our new wizardly figure is probably more likely one of the two blue wizards, since those two do go into the east where this guy's going. But regardless of whoever it is, right? Like we get the familiar dynamic that feels so Tolkien of a wizard and a hobbit journeying together, right? And we can feel, I feel like by the conclusion the wizard has more fully become the wizard, whereas early on in the season the wizard is kind of this raving infant man, understandably just fell from the sky, right? So at the beginning this raving infant man, and then by the end more fully a wizard. And so we get this character that is less familiar but a dynamic that feels very at home. Yeah, I will also say I do wonder if it's just a little representative of kind of our current zeitgeist that rewards people for passing judgment on a property before a real kind of conclusion has been reached, right? um in a similar vein, plenty of people have raved and criticized for various reasons the She-Hulk TV show all throughout its run, but then during the finale a lot of the criticisms that were being levied and things to that effect were addressed, right? And even predicted months in advance. And so I feel like maybe on some occasions, because of the rewarded impatience of kind of the age of the internet, we generally don't really give something time to rise, as it were, and then get frustrated that our bread never became bread, you know? Yeah, not to say, I mean, that's a big societal issue, and there's plenty that's very justified in that. So I don't want to be the moralizing young man shaking his finger at the world. But just a thought, you know.
I wonder if that's a risk inherent in the release styles we're seeing some groups do, right? Like with Amazon or Disney, where they'll release, one episode a week, very, very much like sort of old school television, or, maybe 3 episodes up front and then 1 episode a week versus a show that just releases everything all at once, right? Because people are going to talk about these shows, and you're right, we have so much more access to people having these conversations and making these snap judgments, and then the snap judgments pile on together, good or bad, right? But if the whole show is out, then you can just sort of sit and judge the entirety. So I can understand people wanting viewers to keep visiting their platform, right? Which is, I'm sure, one reason that they space it, to draw out the people watching it and build the hype between episodes, as people do talk about it and ideally get people watching it, and people complaining can even get more people watching. But anyway, just something interesting to think about in terms of the way they're releasing.
So many choices.
How dare you assert that people need to be patient in this day and age? It is unacceptable. Utterly. No.
Utterly.
I think the debate between seasonal dumps and episodic releases is an entire can of worms that we probably shouldn't get into right now, but I will acknowledge that it exists and it is a debate.
That's what I was looking for. Any closing thoughts about Rings of Power?
The rings were pretty. I liked how they actually did give a little montage of the dagger being smelted and the rings getting created, because I love shiny things and I love gemstones. So just having that little shiny goblin part of me be gratified by seeing these pretty pieces of jewelry being created in top-notch visual effects was just a nice little thing at the end of the episode.
Well, it was also one of the best moments of the season with Elrond coming in, intending to confront Galadriel with her concealing information about and that Halbrand isn't Halbrand and it's whatnot, and then him being so entranced by the rings, it really sold me on the power of these objects. And I thought, oh, that was smart. It was really well done.
Also, just the spectacle of Mount Doom, right? That episode cliffhanger, unrealistic as it was, holy hell, that really did something. Yeah.
And people can disagree with me, but I have never seen a fantasy show that looks as good as this one, as consistently good. I see people ragging on visual effects, and I just don't know what they're talking about. I've never seen a show that looks this good.
Well, cool. Well, everybody, we hope this has given you maybe some things to think about where Rings of Power is concerned, or maybe some camaraderie if you were feeling alone in your love of the show. Like always, let us know your thoughts. Let us know what you'd be interested in hearing more from us. But until next time, we'll catch you later, Blockheads.